It was October 4th, 1941, and in Tokyo, the leaders of the Army, the Navy, and the Japanese cabinet were meeting to decide whether to go to war with the United States or to pursue diplomacy and keep the peace. Navy Chief of Staff Nagano and Prime Minister Konoe and others in the meeting had stated their opposition to war in private. Emperor Hirohito had repeatedly urged the leaders to pursue diplomacy with the United States to avoid what he said would be a reckless war. And they all knew that the military had played out war games that showed there was virtually no chance of winning a war with the United States. But in the meeting, Nagano and Konoe and others were silent or even openly stated their support for the war. And so they squandered the last best chance to avoid this reckless war. Instead, they put Japan on the track to attack Pearl Harbor and the destruction of their country. Why? What was it that kept these wise men from speaking out and halting this national suicide they knew would come? Eri Hotta, in her outstanding book, Japan 1941, describes in agonizing detail the slide to war that the Japanese leadership allowed to happen in 1941. How much did Japan's particular culture contribute to the leaders' unwillingness to stand up? And how much did the universal human characteristic of fear contribute? As she wrote, quote, Japanese culture with its intrinsic preference for consensus and harmony, even if of the most superficial kind, cannot have helped to encourage honest discussion about the country's future. At various crucial junctures over the course of 1941, the Japanese language itself, brilliant in negotiating intricate social relations, preserving nuances, and saving face, is not known for its strength in clarifying thoughts or fostering open debate. Nonetheless, though these structural, cultural, social, and even linguistic considerations might help to explain what happened, they're no excuse for the calamitous political misjudgments, end quote. Now, it's also true that these leaders had real cause to fear for their safety. Emperor Hirohito had survived 2 assassination attempts, and Prime Minister Inukai had been assassinated by extremist naval officers in what is called the May 15th incident in 1932. But to not stand up to save their country from a suicidal fate that they fully believed would occur, that speaks more to a universal human characteristic, fear. Yes, they were Japanese, but they had a chance to lead, to speak out and advocate for what they knew to be true and right. But they didn't. There's an expression in Japanese, deru kugi wa utareru. In English, quote, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down, end quote. In other words, conformity and being in harmony with a group is a very strong driver of group and individual behavior in Japan. Yet, we see very similar behavior these days among politicians here in the United States, who in private state their strong disapproval of their leader, but in public or in their votes in Congress fall right in line and support him. Human behavior, of course, is complex, but let me simplify and condense these behaviors into one word here, fear. These examples show that a culture like Japan's can most certainly make it harder for an individual to overcome their fear in a social situation. But even in a culture that is much more oriented towards the individual and individual rights, like ours, fear hinders and can all too often prevent people from doing what they know to be the right thing. How much does fear impact our lives and our work every day? How well are we aware of the ways that fear controls and impacts us and influences our behavior? So let me give you just a little background about me. I was a Japanese history major in college and studied and worked in Tokyo for about 10 years. I loved Japan and the Japanese language. It gave me the chance to have a very interesting business career there. Plus, I met my wife Sheila in Tokyo. She too is a Japanese speaker who had a business career there thanks to her language skills. So I speak Japanese, but I wanted more. So this year I started an experiment. I restarted my journey to learn Spanish one more time. Why? Partly because I wanted to get past novice mid where I was and get to at least intermediate mid where I could begin to use the language and earn a global seal in Spanish besides the one I have in Japanese, but largely because I wanted to feel what it was like to be a lost student again. I was afraid of that feeling, and part of me knew that I needed to really understand how students who took our tests felt, what it felt like to be a student who was afraid, who was stressed about taking a test. So I thought, well, I just better address that. Now, there's a Zen koan, or what you could call a paradox. Quote, "The obstacle is the path," end quote. A koan, as you may know, is a riddle or a puzzle that Zen Buddhists use during meditation to help them unravel greater truths about the world and about themselves. You may have heard the familiar koan, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Now, these are sayings that teachers, Zen teachers, use to train their students, their Zen students, to open their minds to new and different ways of thinking. And even though I take this saying from the Japanese and it originally came from Chinese, this is a pretty universal concept, the idea that the obstacle is the path or the way. The Roman Stoic Marcus Aurelius also used this expression, and it was attributed to them. So I decided to tackle this obstacle of my fear, learning Spanish again, and see if by so doing I could find my path. Of course, everything in our program was online. It was a 12-week Spanish boot camp broken into 2-week sprints. Every sprint, I had a daily 10-minute session with my tutor. My tutor was a Mexican woman, lovely woman, Dalia, married to a Swedish man and living in Gothenburg, Sweden, because that's the world we live in. Everybody is everywhere, and we're all in the same place. On the last day of the 2-week session, we had to give a speech for 5 minutes in front of 2 tutors and 3 of our peers. Nothing like that experience to strip you down to raw anxiety and terror. But the culture of the class, of the program, was to be constructive and supportive, to help us all be our best, and to always remember that we all learn differently and that it's natural to struggle with a language. The teachers kept saying, just think of yourself as a baby, saying what you can and trying to figure out how it all fits together. And even though they kept saying that, I wanted to be perfect. After 6 weeks, I was really discouraged and feeling totally incompetent. I could barely string 3 words together. Every time we had to deliver our speech, I would write out what I wanted to say in English and then translate it in advance on Google Translate because I wanted to be perfect, or at least I didn't want to get it wrong and sound stupid. Now, I'm sure you don't have any students like that, right, who want to be perfect. So I tried to memorize the translation, but I still was at the novice stage. So I could repeat little memorized chunks perfectly, but I wasn't able to take what I knew and create language on my own like I would need to if I were going to be at the intermediate level. The language from Google was well beyond what I really could handle, so I was unable to repeat it. When I had to give the speech, couldn't use notes, I struggled to remember the translation, but couldn't remember it. Instead, I froze. Sometimes my mind just went blank. Sometimes my Japanese would be flooding into my head, and that made me even more confused and panicked. So my wise coach and teacher took me aside and said, don't translate and try to remember that. If you do, you'll only feel like you failed. Just use what you have and build on that without worrying about whether you're right or wrong. That one talk almost miraculously swept away my mental block, and my speaking suddenly became dramatically easier and better. It became fun. It honestly was like a miracle. I was taking what I had, the skills that I had in Spanish and knew, and built on them rather than trying to reach way beyond I was able to do on my own. We know that fear is the biggest obstacle to reaching the intermediate level, and this was a classic example of that. I've been fearing failure because I let myself define failure as something that was impossible for me to do. In language speak, I was forcing myself way beyond my zone of proximal development. After 12 weeks, I had moved from novice high to almost intermediate mid. So those last 6 weeks really had been a success. It allowed me to move up to close to the goal that I had for myself. So I ask you, like I asked myself, When do we turn our fears into obstacles that we put in front of ourselves, and why? How can we reshape those obstacles into opportunities to learn, to grow, and be more successful in our jobs and our lives? When we started our company in 2001, I was painfully aware that I had virtually no experience in the world of language education. One of the happiest days of my life was when Kyle Ennis agreed to leave his position as a Japanese language teacher outside of Portland and join Avant in 2002. I thought, great, he can talk with the teachers in their own language, and I won't have to expose my ignorance about that world to them. And so I essentially delegated any contact with teachers and supervisors to Kyle and some of the other educators we had on our team. I was afraid to talk with you about our test because I was afraid you would recognize that I didn't know much about your world. After the company had grown, in 2010, I decided that I had gotten beyond what I was capable of handling, and so I brought in someone who had worked in a larger company to succeed me. I thought that he could take it to the next level. I was afraid that I couldn't handle a company that had grown so much. What I didn't realize was that my successor didn't share my passion for our company's mission, and that this passion was what was more important than business experience. How do you gain experience, after all? By failing and learning. No different in business, in learning a language, and I assume you tell me, in teaching. After we let my successor go, I came back and had to work to save what was left of the company. We dropped from nearly 100 employees to 12. So given that we had 12 employees, we had to do lots of different things. And I personally had no choice but to go out and meet with teachers and world language supervisors. I remember vividly going in to talk with Don Samples, who was the world language supervisor in Lexington, South Carolina, not long after I'd come back. Don was one of our biggest customers, and I was in awe of the amazing proficiency-based program that she had built in Lexington. I just listened and tried not to ask any stupid questions, and I learned so much from Don and later from the other teachers and supervisors who I met on that trip. Gradually, I began to feel comfortable talking with all of you. Now I realize how silly I was to be afraid. You're all very warm and friendly and patient and understanding. And you're teachers, so you were happy to teach me things that I didn't know. So I appreciate that and thank you all. But I was afraid, and I was lucky enough to be forced to change that particular obstacle of fear into a path forward for me. Now, of course, we are very lucky at Avant to have Dawn on our team, and she's doing great things. But let me go back to Japan and talk a little bit about another kind of fear. When I was working in Tokyo as a fraud investigator and security consultant, I had to try to persuade a number of Japanese companies to build their crisis management plans. That was a really difficult thing in Japan because most all of the organizations didn't really want to have a crisis management plan. Because if they had a crisis, by definition, there were going to be lots of unexpected elements that came up. And what you need to do is to prepare how to best handle those unexpected elements. But no master plan is going to lay out a perfect prescribed plan or guarantee success. No one in those organizations wanted to take responsibility for a plan that didn't have certainty that it would work and succeed. They were all afraid of the risk to themselves and their reputation, so they collectively wished away the danger they were inviting by not doing any planning. Yet if they had focused on their Zen and identified their fear as the obstacle, they'd have seen that the plan was the very thing that they needed to focus on. So if you think about this in our own lives, we're all having to deal with situations like that, although maybe on a smaller scale. We put off that task or shy away from that difficult decision. Sometimes we're afraid to deal with it because there is no guarantee of success. But it's those very things that we're most afraid of dealing with, for one reason or another, that cause the most problems down the road. So can fear drive us to do the right thing? Can we turn that obstacle of fear into a strength? I struggle like anyone else with fear. I hope that maybe I'm learning that when I recognize fear, I need to embrace it and make whatever I'm fearing into a power and a strength. to not let it become a weakness. So it goes back to that saying, the obstacle is the path. If you know something is an obstacle and you embrace it and address it, it becomes the way forward, because that's what's generally standing away. You can open up and move forward once you've addressed it. One of the things about being an entrepreneur and starting your own company is that you really find that you don't have the luxury of avoiding those hard truths, those obstacles. Because if you do, you'll end up losing your company. The luxury of avoiding those hard truths, those obstacles, just doesn't exist in a 20-year-old startup like ours. When you're a small company and self-funded, trying to survive in the world, you just can't avoid those issues. You have to confront them. I've been fortunate to have had mentors who've helped me to see the ways that I'm giving in to my fears. They've helped me to first see how to recognize when I'm giving in to them, and then how to address them. Our company faced very difficult times about 10 years ago and came very close to going out of business. I was very stressed, since going out of business would have meant not only losing the dream we had at Avant, but also losing our home to the bank. In my weekly talks with John, my mentor, I would discuss the things I planned to do to get the company back on its feet. I didn't realize it, but I was holding myself back by hedging my bets. I was so afraid of failure that I was letting my fears take over and hold me back. Instead of saying, I will do something, I was constantly saying, I will try to do something. Now, I'm sure you've all seen Star Wars, and as Yoda said in one of the famous scenes, do or do not, there is no try. Now I realized that saying try was my cheat phrase, my way of giving myself permission to fail, to not go full out to accomplish something. If I failed to do something, then psychologically I wouldn't have to blame myself, because I had given myself permission and I had tried. It was amazing how just removing that word try from my vocabulary made such a positive impact on my attitude, performance, and the outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, at our company I brought in someone who turned out to be a mistake. Early on, he told me that he went into strategic discussions with his team, knowing exactly what the outcome and the decision would be, because he would structure or manipulate the discussion to get the decision he decided was the one he wanted in advance. I thought at first that he was tough and confident, and that was a good thing, until I saw that his decisions weren't generating good outcomes, and his team was becoming increasingly dispirited and unproductive. This painful experience of observing him do this was part of the process of me learning to let go of the fear for my decisions that I had to work out with my management team, the fear that the management team's decision wouldn't be what I wanted it to be, but to trust the team and let them teach me what was best. Now, as I've said, I'm not a professionally trained language teacher, so I can't know all that you deal with, and don't even pretend to. The only teaching I've done was as an English teacher in a cram school, so an after-school program for middle school kids in Japan many years ago. I had 50 bored kids sitting there having fun, giving the American a hard time, but that's it. It was interesting that there was one student who had lived in the US with his parents for several years. He refused to speak to me in English, or even to answer my questions in class. He was afraid to speak in English. I could see his classmates made fun of him because he'd lived overseas and in that way was slightly different from them. So I wonder what kind of fears he had about letting his classmates hear him speak English. For that matter, what fears did his classmates have about their own lack of language skills and knowledge of the world outside of Japan that made them give him such a hard time? So with that very limited experience, I'd like to talk about some of the observations from my Spanish boot camp experience and from raising our sons. One day in Spanish boot camp, I decided I wanted to learn verb conjugations. It was still a nuisance that I could barely get out of the present tense, and I wanted to learn some past tense and some future tense verbs. We had a few textbooks in our office, so I opened up the back of a Spanish first year textbook where the conjugations were. I kept looking for the past tense and the future tense, but all they had were the present tense and a few gerunds, and that was it. Now, I know not all textbooks do that, but what was the publisher of this textbook thinking? Who in the world only speaks in the present tense? Why would the publishing company not provide resources so students who wanted to do more than what they were taught in class could do? Were they afraid that students might study and learn something the textbook hadn't included or that the teachers hadn't taught? As a learner, I wanted to have easy access to the things I want to learn, whether they fit into a sequence or not. And that is the world our students and all of us live in. We live in the world of Google Translate and everybody having a different interest, a different focus. So let me tell you a story about my son's experience. And this is a story from Oregon, not Massachusetts. Having grown up in Dedham and gone to school in Boston, I'm sure this is a very different story than you would have here in Massachusetts. So my son is now an advanced speaker of German, thanks to the year in Germany on the Congress Bundestag program. Now, here I just want to thank our sponsor, Experitas, that promotes and supports learners in their international immersion programs. Those programs change lives, and it changed the life of our son and my wife, who was a student in Japan when she was in high school. So, back to the story. He loves German. When he was in high school, he humored his parents by taking Japanese before going to Germany, because unfortunately, our district cut their German program several years ago. As parents, we all want to help our kids, right? So sometimes he would come home to Sheila and me and ask for help. Once in a while, we would give him some vocabulary that fit his writing homework. One day, we were working with him and offered a word that would fit particularly well. He said, "Dad, please don't do that. Last time, I got in trouble because I used the word that you guys told me to use, and my teacher hadn't taught it to me. So she failed me on the assignment because she said I didn't teach you that word." So what was all about? Why does she need to control and limit her learners? What in the world was that teacher afraid of? That our son might learn something she hadn't taught him? God forbid. As a manager, I fear every day that some of my decisions are the wrong ones. I've got two options. I can either lock things down and force the organization to do things my way and follow my decision, or open up those decisions and the decision-making process to the team and trust that their collective wisdom is going to lead to a better decision. As Steve Jobs said, I don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. And I'm very blessed, and our company is very blessed to have some wonderful people, some very, very, very sharp people in our company. So my general principle on decision making is that if I can't persuade my leadership team that some idea I have is a good one, I'm almost certainly wrong. But sometimes, once in a blue moon, as a leader, you believe that you have to do something your team disagrees with, and they can't persuade me or you that I or you are wrong. Those times, I need the courage to embrace the fear that comes from going it alone and push ahead. And as teachers, you're all leaders. You're all leaders of your class, you're leaders of your students, and you're leaders in creating the future of our country and the world. So what we do as teachers, as leaders, and as citizens. This has been one crazy time. Throughout history, crises have caused people to rethink assumptions and take on challenges they thought weren't possible or that they were afraid of. Out of the ashes of World War II, there was an amazing burst of new creative businesses like Honda and Sony, and a nation that took on entirely new ways of thinking that created the economic miracle of Japan. The Sputnik crisis in the 50s in the US caused us to change the way we taught science and increase funding for world language studies. It even led us to take on the challenge of something that had seemed impossible, to put an astronaut on the moon. The past 18 months have been very trying times, especially for all of you. It has been a time when we have had to put aside our fears and do things in a very new and challenging way, teaching online or even in hybrid classes. Ryan Gray wrote, quote, "In the game of business and life, chaos rewrites the rules," end quote. Goodness knows we've had enough chaos in the past year. This can be our opportunity, the chance to challenge our assumptions, to see clearly the things that we have feared the most, take them on, and turn them into new and better ways of living, learning, and leading. Thank you.